I remember the exact moment I saw him for the first time. It wasn't just a fleeting glance. It was as if my entire body recoiled and surged forward at once, as if something inside me recognized something my eyes couldn't yet grasp. I was leaving the church, my hands still scented with anointing oil, when he crossed my path, walking slowly along the cracked sidewalk leading to the town center. No one knew him, no one knew his name, but within seconds, the whispers began. A stranger. Where's he from? He doesn't look like he's from here. To me, though, he seemed to have come from somewhere much deeper. It wasn't just the way he walked, as if one foot was in the present and the other in another time. It was his eyes. My God, those eyes! They carried an ancient sadness, as if he'd seen too much, lost too much, loved and buried more than anyone in that town would ever dare to dream. And yet there was calm, as if pain had taught him a rare kind of silence. Not the kind that imprisons, but the kind that holds. I tried not to show anything, of course. Pastor's daughter, as I was always reminded. The one who must smile with her eyes, maintain composure, not let the world notice the winds stirring in her chest. But there was no pretending. When he turned, his face to me, it was as if my name had been whispered before any introduction. And though he didn't say a word in that first moment, something inside me already knew. This man wasn't here by chance. He had come for me. It took a while to see him again, maybe by his choice, maybe out of my fear. In the week that followed, I heard his name in hushed tones among the grocery store shelves and the church pews. They called him a stranger, a wanderer, a lost soul. They said he'd come from far away, from a place where bad things had happened. One elderly woman, her voice trembling, claimed he could see the future. They laughed at her, of course, as they always do when someone says something others lack the courage to believe. But I didn't laugh, because something in that woman, in her time-worn face, carried the same gravity I saw in his eyes. And deep down, as much as I tried to silence it, I wanted it to be true. It was on a rainy afternoon that I saw him again. I was walking alone, escaping the weight of so many unasked questions, and there he was, sitting under the roof of the old community hall, arms crossed, eyes fixed on nothing or everything. When I approached, he looked at me as if he'd been expecting me, even though we'd never planned to meet. And then, for the first time, he spoke to me. His voice was low, steady, and sent a shiver up my spine, like a prayer reaching where no words could go. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "But since you are, listen carefully." I stood frozen, motionless. He looked deep into me and added, "I saw you, not today, not now, but soon, crying because of me, and yet choosing. To stay, the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, not because of the words themselves, but because of how he said them. There was no doubt, no hesitation. He spoke with the cold certainty of someone who already knew what was coming, and that scared me more than anything. I wanted to laugh, to run, to scream, but I did nothing. I stood there, staring at this man who claimed to know a piece of my future, trying to understand why my soul, instead of retreating, was starting to draw closer. It was madness, of course. All of it. A man who sees the future. A pastor's daughter listening in silence. And yet, there was a peace in his presence. Something quieter than the world, but that spoke louder to me, as if he wasn't trying to convince me of anything, just to warn, just to fulfill an inevitable part of the path. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my distance. I returned to the church routine, to household chores, to the commitments that had filled my life forever. But something had changed. It was as if every prayer I offered now stumbled on a silent doubt. As if every verse I read trembled slightly in my hands. His face appeared when I closed my eyes, and his words echoed in the margins of the sermons I heard. Crying because of me, and yet choosing to stay. How could someone say something like that with such certainty? And why, despite the absurdity, couldn't my heart let it go? The town didn't forget him either. The rumors grew heavier. They said he was a fraud, that he'd escaped from an institution, that he used this seeing the future story to manipulate the weak. My father was one of the first to sound the alarm. He told me to stay away, that it was dangerous, that it was the work of the devil, and when he used that phrase, I knew it wasn't just the pastor speaking, but the man, trying to protect his daughter. I wanted to obey. I wanted to erase it all from my memory and pretend nothing had happened. But there was something in me, a restlessness that grew and found no rest in the advice that had always been enough. And then, on that night when the winds seemed determined to tear the roofs off the town, he appeared outside the church. I waited for him to leave, but he didn't move. When I stepped out, ready to tell him to stop, that I didn't want to hear anymore, he interrupted me with a sentence that made my soul freeze. The next time you hesitate, ask yourself if you want a destiny imposed or a destiny chosen. It was as if he knew everything I'd been struggling to hide, even from myself. He didn't try to justify himself. He just looked at me. And for the first time, I felt seen entirely, not as the pastor's daughter, not as the town girl, but as Naomi Claire, the one who didn't yet know who she was, but desperately wanted to find out. That night, I cried. Not for him, not yet, but for me, for everything I'd been hiding. Beneath the mask of obedience, something in me broke, and strangely, when dawn broke, I felt something new had been born. It was strange waking up that morning and not rushing to the church's commitments. The sun had barely touched the windows, and yet I knew I couldn't keep pretending. The previous night had left marks on me, not visible, but deep. Something had shattered, and for the first time, I didn't run to fix it. Instead, I dressed slowly, tied my hair with a random scarf, and walked to the town center without explaining myself to anyone. I needed to see him, not for answers, but because my soul seemed caught in something only he could unlock, and maybe because, in some place I couldn't yet name, a part of me had already chosen to believe him. The reunion was quiet. He was sitting on the same bench at the old hall, eyes closed, as if listening to a song only he could hear. When I opened my mouth to speak, he simply said, "You came," and I didn't know how to respond. I sat beside him without asking permission. And for a while, we just let the silence envelop us. He was the one to break the quiet, saying he didn't control what he saw, that the visions came like dreams that belonged to no one but demanded to be remembered. He said he didn't always understand what they meant, but when he saw me, it was different. "You weren't an image," he said. "You were a feeling, a certainty." His words left me restless and at the same time comforted, because somehow I felt it too. A connection that defied logic and anchored itself in a much older place. In the days that followed, we met more often, never in secret, but never fully exposed either. We began to talk about faith, about destiny, about the small choices we make, every day thinking they're just routines, but which in truth shape the paths that define us. He told me about his childhood, about the first time he had a vision of a fall that saved someone, about how he tried to ignore it for years until he realized that running from the gift was worse than carrying it. I listened intently, but also with a persistent doubt. Did he also see an end to all this? Was there, in some vision, a possible us? It didn't take long for the town to notice our closeness. The church ladies began whispering during services. Some young people avoided greeting me, and my father called me into his office and told me, with teary eyes, that I was straying from God's purpose. That hurt more than it should have, but not because of what he said, but because I realized that maybe purpose wasn't something imposed from the outside, but something that could only be born within us. That same day, he appeared at my doorstep, his eyes heavier than ever. He said he'd had a new vision, and in it, I was on my knees, facing a choice that would change everything. I spent sleepless nights trying to understand what that vision meant, facing a choice that would change everything. Those words spun in my mind like an endless sermon. He wouldn't tell me the details. He only said that pain and beauty walked together in that future, and it wasn't fair to influence me. But how could I not be influenced by something like that? How could I go on living as before when someone, with that silent conviction, claimed to have seen me broken by my own decision? I began to see everything differently. The church pews, now half empty, seemed to represent more than absence. They were a metaphor for the space I needed within myself. My father's sermons, once comforting, sounded like old molds for a soul that was beginning to expand. It was during this time that the dreams began. Confusing images, intense sensations. I saw forked paths, heard my own name called by different voices, and sometimes I saw his eyes. I didn't wake up frightened, but always with the feeling of returning from somewhere real. One morning, I woke with a phrase on the tip of my tongue. Not every destiny is a prison. And I knew I hadn't made it up. It came from somewhere, deeper. I told him about it, and for the first time, he seemed shaken. He said some people are more sensitive than they realize, and that maybe I wasn't just listening, but starting to see. Our intimacy grew, but so did the doubts. Did I love him? Or was I just fascinated by the idea of escaping the life laid out for me? Did he love me? Or was he a prisoner of the visions that led him to me? We began to argue. Small differences became bigger. He wanted to pull away to protect me, saying the pain was coming and that love might not be enough. I, on the other hand, felt I was finally building something that was mine. For the first time, I wasn't anyone's daughter. I was Naomi, whole, restless, broken, but my own. But none of that seemed to matter when, on a quiet night, the inevitable happened. One of the visions he'd described came true. An accident on the road. Someone I loved. And the premonition he carried had been real. I saw the pain take shape with my own eyes, and in that moment everything he represented to me transformed. He stopped being a strange promise and became truth. Not because he wanted to be, but because he was. And that tore me apart in a way I didn't yet know how to mend. That night, after the accident took someone I loved, and his words proved true as if time were merely following a pre-written script, I couldn't look at him the same way. Part of me wanted to embrace him and say I believed, that I finally understood the weight of what he carried. But another part, still bleeding, wanted to blame him for not preventing it, for seeing and not stopping it, for foreseeing and still letting it happen. He didn't try to defend himself. He just looked at me with that same ancient, tired, calm gaze and said that some things can't be changed, only lived. I went days without speaking to him. The town sank into mourning, and my family clung to faith like a lifeboat. My father, perhaps unaware of everything, just held my hands tighter during every prayer, as if trying to anchor me in the world crumbling inside me. But it was too late. I no longer fully belonged to that place. I had crossed the border between the predictable and the impossible, and there was no going back without losing myself. Still, I resisted. I tried to anchor myself in what remained of routine, but nothing fit anymore. Not the learned faith, not the memorized words, Not the role everyone expected me to play. I was breaking apart between two worlds, the one that raised me and the one calling me. Then he came back, without warning, without invitation. He just appeared at my doorstep, his eyes darker than ever, his breath heavy. "I had another vision," he said, his voice hoarse, broken. "And this time, I can't stay." My chest tightened in a strange way, as if my heart wanted to leap out and hold him there. "What did you see?" I asked, and he hesitated. For the first time, he hesitated. "I saw you, alone, but at peace." Those were the most painful words I'd ever heard, because deep down, I knew he was saying goodbye, not as someone giving up, but as someone who understands that sometimes love is also knowing when to leave. I wanted to beg him to stay, to grab his hand and say we'd face everything together, but I said nothing, because in that moment I learned his silence. Silence that isn't absence, but reverence. A silence that accepts what can't be changed, but honors what was lived. And so he left, leaving me with more questions than answers, and with a love that even interrupted felt eternal. As he walked away, something inside me said this wasn't an end. It was just a turn, in a story still being written. Months passed since that goodbye, and his absence settled into the spaces of my life like an old, persistent, silent perfume. There were no more scandals, no rumors, no sidelong glances. The town resumed its usual slowness, and I went on too, or at least tried. I stayed steadfast in the tasks that remained, but I wasn't the same woman. Something in me had changed shape. I was no longer just the pastor's daughter. I became someone who faced the unknown and survived, who loved without guarantees, who believed in the invisible, even when everything around demanded explanations. He left me nothing but memories, no letter, no final message. And yet, every day, I woke with the sense that he was still with me, not in body, but in the trace he left on my soul. It wasn't just longing, it was something deeper, as if his departure had revealed a part of myself I'd never have discovered otherwise. I started writing, not intending to show anyone, notes on loose sheets, trying to translate feelings words could barely hold. And it was then, on an ordinary late afternoon, that I received the letter. It came in an envelope with no return address, my name handwritten. I recognized his handwriting before even opening it. The letter was short, but heavy, like a prophecy. He wrote that the visions had stopped, that for the first time in years the future was blank, and that this scared him, but also freed him. He said he'd had one last dream, not a vision, and in it I was standing at a train station, dressed in white, smiling. He said he didn't know if it was real or just a disguised wish. But still, he asked something of me, that if I still loved him, I'd be at a specific place on a specific date. Not to start over, he wrote, but to choose. The letter trembled in my hands. It was madness, of course. I had responsibilities, commitments, a family still expecting me to return to who I was. But how could I go back to being her when that version no longer existed? With each passing day, the idea of going to that place stopped seeming absurd and started seeming necessary, not for him, but for me. Because sometimes you need to follow a path, even without knowing what's at the end, just to prove you're no longer afraid to walk. I packed a bag like preparing a prayer. Few clothes, a notebook, the letter carefully folded. I left no notes, gave no explanations. I just went. For the first time in my life, I left that town not to visit relatives or attend services at other churches, but to find myself. The road was long, crossing landscapes I only knew from books or television, and with every mile traveled, I felt parts of me letting go. Old fears, inherited guilt, expectations that were never mine. It was as if, finally, I was shedding the Naomi others had shaped, making space for the woman I was choosing to be. The place mentioned in the letter was simple but precise. An old decommissioned train station surrounded by trees beginning to turn golden with autumn. I arrived with my heart racing, my eyes scanning every corner as if he might appear at any moment. But there was no one. I waited. Minutes, then hours. I sat on the weathered wooden bench and let the breeze touch my face. At first I felt the weight of disappointment. And then something unexpected. Relief. Because there, alone, I realized the most important choice had already been made. I went, I believed, I moved, and that was enough. As the sun sank slowly, behind the trees, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I felt a kind of peace that didn't come from outside, but from within, a silence that didn't hurt, but healed. I thought of him, the way he looked at me without judging, the courage he had to leave when everything in him begged to stay. And I understood that love sometimes is exactly this. Not an immediate, happy ending, but the strength that pushes us toward freedom. I stayed there until the day darkened, then stood and returned. I returned different. I returned whole. Back home, I wrote about everything I'd lived, not in a rush, nor to publish, but to not forget. And with every page written, something bloomed. The conviction that the future doesn't need to be foreseen to be beautiful. It just needs to be lived, one step at a time, with faith, not the faith I inherited, but the one that now belongs to me. Time passed unhurriedly after that day, and I stopped rushing too. I learned to wake up slowly, to make my coffee without the urgency to be useful to someone. I learned to walk alone on the trails around the town, now with eyes more attuned to the details, as if everything around me was trying to teach me something all the time. I returned home with a transformed heart, but I didn't announce it to anyone. There was no longer a need to prove anything or explain the winds that changed me. I just lived, a quieter, more mine life. What no one knew was that every night, before sleeping, I returned to that letter. I read each line like a psalm, and even without a response, without a return, without knowing if he still thought of me, I felt at peace. He had said the vision stopped, and to me, that was the greatest gift. It meant that perhaps, for the first time, he could live the now, without carrying the weight of what was to come, and knowing that was enough for me. I didn't need his presence to keep loving. What I felt no longer depended on physical presence, but on the transformation that love brought to my soul. But fate, that old trickster, still had one more twist in store. It was on a cold morning, months later, while I was organizing books in the church library, that I heard the door open. I didn't look up right away, but when I did, my world stopped. There he was, older, thinner, but with the same eyes, still tired, still deep. He took a step and paused, as if waiting for my permission to continue, and I, with my heart bursting, just said, "You came back." He nodded, his voice low as always. The visions didn't return. For the first time, I don't know what's going to happen. I only know I'm here. In that moment, I knew nothing more needed to be said, because when the future stops being a certainty, the present becomes sacred. He didn't return for a prophecy. He returned by choice, and I welcomed him, not by destiny, but by love. A love that survived time, silence, absence, and doubt. A love that didn't begin with promises, but with courage. And there, among dusty books and a gray sky beginning to clear, I finally understood what he meant in that first vision. Crying. Because of me, and yet choosing to stay. Yes, I cried, but yes, I chose.